He thought he'd lost everything that mattered, until two little girls called him Daddy, and the woman he left behind gave him a second chance he never believed he deserved. Before we get started, leave a comment below and let us know where you're watching from so we can say hello to you. Now, on to the story. From the 72nd floor of a gleaming glass tower in Midtown Manhattan, Landon Pierce ruled his empire with the cold, calculated efficiency of a machine. At just 38, he was the kind of man who made Fortune magazine covers look like personal victories. The CEO of Pierce Tech, a multinational tech firm that bridged Wall Street and Silicon Valley, Landon was respected, feared, envied, and utterly alone. His days ran on precise algorithms. Mornings began with a black coffee brewed to 190 degrees, no cream. His suits, always navy or charcoal, were tailored to perfection. Meetings were scheduled down to the minute. Spontaneity was a foreign concept, too risky, too emotional. Emotions, after all, had no place in a world built on power and control. But behind the tailored suits and relentless discipline, Landon carried a quiet agony. It wasn't a business loss or a failed merger. It wasn't even heartbreak, at least, not in the conventional sense. It was something far more personal, something that had dismantled a part of him that no one else ever saw. 3 years ago, in a sterile office beneath harsh fluorescent lights, Landon sat across from a specialist whose words carved a permanent scar across his soul. "I'm sorry, Mr. Pierce. The tests are conclusive. You're infertile. It's irreversible and congenital." The words were delivered clinically, with the same tone a banker might use when denying a loan. Landon didn't flinch. He nodded once, like he was approving a quarterly report. He didn't ask questions. He didn't argue. He just stood up, walked out, and never returned to that building again. But something inside him had fractured that day. He buried it deep, like everything else that threatened his sense of control. Not even his closest colleagues suspected a thing. To them, he remained the impenetrable titan, cool, polished, untouchable. The timing of the diagnosis couldn't have been worse. Just weeks earlier, he had ended things with Ivy Monroe, the only woman who had ever gotten close enough to see past the armor. Their love had been intense, messy, and far too real. She was everything he wasn't, warm, impulsive, fearless with her heart. And he was terrified. Terrified that if she saw the cracks in him, she'd run. So, he ran first. He told himself it was for the best, that love was a distraction. He changed his number. Boarded a jet to Tokyo. Buried himself in code, in contracts, in conference calls. He convinced himself that his career was all that mattered, that if he couldn't build a family, he'd build a legacy instead. But some nights, when the city lights flickered against the glass of his penthouse, Landon couldn't stop the question from whispering through the silence. What if he had stayed? He had the world at his feet. But none of it could fill the quiet space Ivy had once occupied. And nothing, no success, no billion-dollar deal, could rewrite what the doctor had said. He would never be a father. At least, that's what he believed. Until everything changed. 3 years ago, the last fragile piece of Landon Pierce's personal life unraveled in a storm of unspoken emotions, impulsive decisions, and deafening silence. It had started with love, real love, the kind that caught him off guard, the kind he never thought someone like him could experience. Ivy Monroe had been everything he wasn't. Where he was calculated, she was instinctive. Where he guarded every feeling behind walls of success and sarcasm, she laid hers bare without apology. And that terrified him. He didn't know how to handle someone who loved without conditions. Landon had been reeling from the infertility diagnosis when everything between them combusted. It was a quiet afternoon in his penthouse. The sky outside was cloudy, the city muted in gray tones, as Ivy paced near the floor-to-ceiling windows, her voice shaking with frustration. "You're not even here anymore, Landon," she had said, her eyes glistening but her voice strong. "You say nothing, you feel nothing, and every time I try to get close, you push me further out." He didn't respond. Not then. Not with words. He just stared at her, jaw tight, expression unreadable, every emotion warring beneath his polished exterior. What could he have told her? That just days before, a doctor had looked him in the eye and told him he would never be a father? That the one future he hadn't allowed himself to dream of, a real family, maybe even with Ivy, had just been torn from him with sterile medical certainty? No. He couldn't say it. Couldn't say he felt like less of a man. Couldn't bear to show weakness, not even to the woman he loved. So instead, he did what Landon Pierce had always done when control slipped from his grasp. He disappeared. Not in the dramatic, door-slamming, shouting match way. No, Landon's withdrawal was clean. Cold. Surgical. The next morning, Ivy woke up to an empty side of the bed. His phone number no longer worked. His assistant gave vague, meaningless explanations. A week later, Ivy found out he had flown to Singapore for business, indefinitely. And just like that, she was gone from his life. The silence between them became a chasm. One he refused to cross, no matter how often her name burned in the back of his mind during sleepless nights or how many times he stared at his phone, hand frozen, willing himself not to call. In the months that followed, Landon threw himself into work with brutal discipline. He launched new subsidiaries, closed deals across continents, and doubled the valuation of his company. He won awards, built influence, climbed Forbes lists. And yet, every win felt dull. Every celebration felt forced. Every morning began with the quiet ache of absence. He told himself Ivy was better off without him. That a woman like her deserved someone who could give her the life she wanted, children, family, warmth, and not a broken man who had nothing to offer but stock portfolios and silence. But no matter how much he tried to bury the memory of her, it lingered. In the way he brewed his coffee the way she liked it. In the scarf she had once left on his couch that he never quite managed to throw away. In the echo of her laugh that sometimes played in his head during quiet drives home from the office. He kept telling himself it was over. He had made peace with it. Had chosen his path. Had moved on. But that was a lie. The truth was, Landon never stopped loving Ivy Monroe. He just didn't believe he deserved her anymore. And so, in his glass tower above the city, he watched the seasons change without her. He passed anniversaries he never marked, birthdays he never dared acknowledge. He told himself the pain was the price of control. Until the day Ivy returned. And nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared him for what she brought with her. From the outside, Landon Pierce had it all. At 38, the billionaire CEO of Pierce Innovations commanded respect with every decision he made, every deal he signed, every move he orchestrated. His face appeared on magazine covers, his name echoed in elite boardrooms, and his signature was worth more than some companies' annual profits. From his penthouse office high above Midtown Manhattan, he watched the city pulse with ambition, a mirror of his own. But beneath that perfectly pressed suit, behind the impassive expression he wore like armor, Landon was quietly, devastatingly hollow. Every part of his life had been built on structure. Mornings began with silence and a green smoothie. Meetings followed with ruthless precision. Evenings ended with his phone still buzzing in his hand as the skyline twinkled like a promise he no longer believed in. He had mastered the art of detachment, no clutter, no noise, no vulnerability. But he could never quite silence the echo of that one memory. The doctor's voice, calm and clinical. "You're infertile. It's congenital. I'm sorry." It had been 3 years, and yet the words remained fresh, replaying in the quiet spaces of his mind like a cruel soundtrack. He hadn't told anyone, not his board, not his friends, not even his assistant who had been with him for a decade. Landon didn't just keep secrets. He buried them so deep even he pretended they no longer existed. But pretending hadn't worked. Especially not at night, when the city quieted and he stood alone in his penthouse, staring out at the vastness below. He had everything, yet nothing that made it truly matter. No small footsteps echoing down the hall. No soft laughter to break the sterile silence. No one waiting for him at the door, or clinging to his hand during storms. He told himself he didn't need those things. That he was wired differently. That legacy was more important than love. That success was more stable than family. But it was all a lie, one he told himself so often, he almost believed it. Almost. The truth was, Landon had once known warmth. He had once let someone in. Her name was Ivy Monroe. She had been wild and kind and unpredictable, the very opposite of him. Ivy had challenged every rule, broken through his walls, laughed at his control. She had taught him how to feel in a world that demanded he stay cold. But that had also terrified him. And when his infertility diagnosis came, it pushed him over an edge he didn't even realize he stood on. Instead of sharing his pain, he disappeared. Changed his number. Took an impromptu business trip to Singapore. Buried himself so deeply in strategy and spreadsheets that he hoped the ache would stop. But it didn't. And now, years later, with Ivy just a ghost in his past and the prospect of fatherhood a closed door, Landon had built a fortress around his life, beautiful, impenetrable, and utterly lifeless. His colleagues praised his discipline. Investors admired his logic. The media called him a visionary. But no one knew the man behind the curtain. No one noticed the shadows under his eyes. No one questioned why he never attended weddings, held children, or spoke of anything beyond quarterly gains. He had created a life that was all surface, no substance. A world where nothing could touch him, and where nothing real could grow. Still, on rare, brutally honest nights, Landon would stand in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, scotch untouched in his hand, and wonder. What if I hadn't left her? What if I wasn't broken? What if there's more to life than all this? Those moments never lasted long. He always pushed them away, sealed the cracks, straightened his tie. But the emptiness remained. And he had no idea that it was about to end, completely, irreversibly, with just one name whispered into his ear. There's a woman downstairs, his assistant would say soon. Her name is Ivy Monroe. She has children with her. And in that single moment, the empire Landon built on silence, denial, and control, would begin to crumble. The boardroom buzzed with tension. Landon Pierce sat at the head of a long glass conference table, surrounded by top executives, lawyers, and analysts, all eyes on him as a high-stakes merger discussion heated up. The room was sleek and sterile, like much of Landon's world, efficient, calculated, perfectly designed to keep chaos and emotion at bay. He tapped his Mont Blanc pen slowly against the edge of his leather notebook, his jaw locked in concentration. On the screen, projections for the fourth quarter flickered, but his mind was already 4 steps ahead, dissecting every risk. And then, a soft knock on the conference room door. Unusual. Unscheduled. His assistant, Julia, poked her head in, her face pale. She leaned in toward Landon's chair, whispering just low enough that the room wouldn't catch it. But the words hit like a thunderclap. Mr. Pierce, there's a woman downstairs. She has 2 children with her. She says her name is Ivy Monroe. For one long second, Landon didn't move. Didn't blink. His heartbeat slammed against his ribs. That name. It wasn't just a ghost, it was the earthquake that had fractured his past and built the cold empire around him. Ivy Monroe. The woman he had once allowed into his carefully guarded world. The one he had walked away from with military precision. Hearing her name now, after all these years, in the middle of a multi-billion-dollar meeting, was like a gut punch. He cleared his throat sharply and stood, his chair scraping quietly behind him. "I'll be back," he said simply, his tone clipped. No explanation. No apology. The room fell awkwardly silent as he exited. The elevator ride down felt longer than usual, though it lasted less than a minute. Landon's hands were clenched into fists at his sides, his expression unreadable. But inside, the storm had already begun to rage. Ivy Monroe. After everything, why now? When the elevator doors opened to the polished marble lobby of Pierce Technologies, he saw her instantly. Ivy. She stood just beside the reception desk, her posture composed, her arms full of children. Twin toddlers, no more than 2 years old, clung tightly to her sides, each in a matching pastel coat, one blue, one yellow. Both girls had soft, wavy blonde hair that curled near their ears, and impossibly wide blue eyes that stopped Landon in his tracks. No. It couldn't be. But it was. Ivy turned to face him as if she had sensed his presence before she even saw him. Her eyes met his, calm but unflinching, 1,000 unspoken things resting in their stare. Her beauty hadn't faded, if anything, it had matured into something stronger, more grounded. But there was a tiredness there too, a quiet edge in her expression that hadn't existed before. And the children, those eyes. His eyes. Landon swallowed hard. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Ivy shifted the girl on her right hip slightly and stepped forward. Her voice was low, firm. No theatrics. No rehearsed lines. Just the truth, delivered like a blow to the gut. "We need to talk, Landon," she said. Then came the words that cracked open everything. "These are your daughters." The lobby, still humming with the low voices of employees and the shuffle of polished shoes on marble, seemed to vanish. Landon heard nothing. Felt nothing but the dizzying thunder of disbelief exploding in his chest. His daughters? No. It couldn't be. It was biologically impossible. He remembered every word from that sterile office 3 years ago. Congenital infertility. Irreversible. He'd heard it. Processed it. Buried it. And yet. He looked again at the girls, mirror images of Ivy, but with hints of his jawline, his eyes, his impossible DNA staring back at him like a challenge from fate. He was suddenly weightless. Not from joy. From absolute, consuming shock. He stared at Ivy, but his voice came out cold, distant. "What are you talking about?" Ivy didn't flinch. "You heard me," she replied quietly, stepping forward so he could see them up close. "Ava. Ellie. They're yours, Landon. And you need to hear the truth." For the first time in years, Landon Pierce, the man who orchestrated corporate takeovers with a single phone call, who had silenced boardrooms with a glance, stood completely, utterly powerless. And he knew, nothing in his life would ever be the same again. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, but the sound did nothing to prepare Landon Pierce for what he was about to see. His polished leather shoes stepped onto the marble lobby floor, echoing with each stride as he walked toward the front desk, heart pounding harder with every step. Years of self-control, of boardroom wars and media battles, had never made him feel this unsteady. But now, the name alone, Ivy Monroe, had cracked open something he thought was sealed shut. She was right there, standing near the receptionist's counter, her arms full, no, not full, occupied, by 2 small children. Identical. 2 toddlers, bundled in soft pastel jackets, their tiny bodies pressed into her sides, each holding a stuffed animal worn at the seams. They clung to Ivy instinctively, one resting her cheek against her shoulder, the other fiddling with the zipper of Ivy's coat with chubby fingers. Their soft blonde curls framed round faces, and their blue eyes, his blue eyes, met Landon's gaze with wordless curiosity. The room seemed to still. The ambient noise of hushed conversations, elevator pings, and ringing phones all melted away into a blur of white noise. All Landon could hear was the sound of his own heartbeat, hammering against his ribs. Ivy saw him, and without hesitation, met his eyes with a calmness that shook him. She didn't flinch. Didn't look away. Instead, she adjusted one of the girls on her hip, took a slow breath, and walked forward. She looked different, but not in the way time usually marks a person. She was still beautiful, still graceful, but there was a heaviness in her that hadn't been there before. Sleepless nights and quiet resilience had etched themselves into the gentle lines around her eyes, into the weight of her step. Ivy Monroe was no longer the free-spirited woman he remembered, she was a mother now. A fighter. And she was here for a reason. When she stopped a few feet away, the words came slowly, but without hesitation. "We need to talk, Landon," she said, her voice steady, almost too calm. "These are your daughters." The sentence struck him like a punch to the chest. Landon didn't move. Couldn't. He just stared at her, his breath caught halfway to his lungs. His brain scrambled to make sense of the words, but they didn't compute. Daughters? His lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. He looked from Ivy to the two little girls, mirror images of each other, and disturbingly, hauntingly, of him. "No," he whispered, almost to himself. That's not possible." He saw Ivy's jaw tighten just slightly. "It is. And it's time you knew." The girls continued to clutch her, unaware of the weight their presence carried, the tectonic shift their very existence had triggered in the center of Landon's world. He felt dizzy. He reached for something solid, logic, fact, science, but nothing held. "I was told. I can't have children," he murmured, more to the past than to Ivy. "I was told, it was impossible." "I know what you were told," Ivy replied gently, but firmly. "And I know why you believed it. But Landon, they're yours." Her tone left no room for doubt. No invitation for argument. Just fact, delivered with heartbreak and strength in equal measure. Landon's eyes dropped again to the children. One of them looked up at him, squinting, then pointed silently at his watch with a giggle. It was such a small, innocent gesture, but it nearly brought him to his knees. He wanted to deny it, to cling to the sterile diagnosis he had accepted as a truth, but how could he? The evidence was standing right in front of him, in tiny shoes, with rosebud lips and his mother's dimples. He took a shaky step back, blinking fast, every part of his carefully constructed life beginning to tilt. I don't understand," he said. "How can they be mine?" "I'll explain everything," Ivy said. "But not here. Not like this. We need to talk, really talk." Landon looked around the lobby. Executives walked past, oblivious. Employees typed away at laptops nearby, unaware that their emotionally untouchable CEO was breaking apart, piece by piece, in front of them. He looked back at Ivy. At the girls. And for the first time in years, the word control meant nothing. He nodded slowly, his voice no more than a whisper. "Come with me." And with that, Landon led Ivy and the daughters he never knew he had into a small private conference room, his entire world tilting into something unrecognizable, terrifying, and yet, impossibly real. Landon sat in the small, windowless conference room just off the lobby, the door shut behind him with a soft but final click. The air felt too still, too thick, like something was about to collapse. Across from him, Ivy Monroe stood silently, her eyes steady, unreadable. At her feet, the twins, Ava and Ellie, played with quiet curiosity, blissfully unaware of the emotional earthquake rippling through the room. "Ivy, this doesn't make sense," Landon said, his voice sharp, edged with disbelief. He ran a hand through his neatly styled hair, disrupting its usual perfection. I was told it wasn't possible." She didn't interrupt. Instead, she reached into her worn leather handbag and pulled out a white envelope. Without a word, she extended it toward him. Landon hesitated for a heartbeat, then took it, his fingers trembling ever so slightly. He flipped it over, his breath caught somewhere between his chest and throat. His name was on the report. Pierce, Landon, biological father, probability, 99.9%. He read the line once. Then again. Then a third time, slower, as if somehow the letters might shift or rearrange into something logical, something he could explain. But they didn't. The words remained cold, clinical, irreversible. He lowered the paper slowly, looking up at Ivy like a man standing at the edge of a cliff he hadn't seen coming. Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "I did the test through a private clinic," she replied calmly, though there was a strain beneath her composure. 3 weeks ago. I wanted to be absolutely sure before I came here. Before I turned your world upside down." Landon's jaw clenched. His thoughts tumbled over themselves, racing, crashing. He had trusted the doctor's diagnosis like gospel. 3 years ago, the words, congenital, irreversible, and infertile, had struck him like hammers, and he had locked them deep inside, far away from his public persona. That diagnosis had sealed off a whole part of his identity, turned a painful breakup into a permanent door slammed shut. And yet, here were 2 little girls. Living proof that everything he thought he knew about himself was wrong. He looked at them, Ava with a stuffed bunny held tightly in one hand, Ellie tugging gently at her sister's sleeve, both of them with wide, searching blue eyes. His eyes. Ivy's eyes. Their eyes. "How?" he whispered, barely able to form the word. "I mean, after what they told me, I didn't think." "I don't know," Ivy said quietly. "All I know is that I was pregnant when you left. I tried to reach you. I tried, Landon. But you disappeared. New number. No forwarding address. And I wasn't about to send a letter to your company and risk being labeled a gold digger." Landon's face burned, shame creeping up his neck. He had buried that part of his life under piles of deals, acquisitions, and boardroom strategies. And now, it had clawed its way back, demanding to be seen. "I wasn't trying to trap you," she added, her voice trembling slightly now. "I didn't even want to come back. But Ellie got sick a few weeks ago. Nothing serious, just a high fever, but it scared me. It made me realize, they deserve to know who their father is. And you deserve to know them." Silence stretched between them, the kind that feels like it might never end. Landon looked down at the paper again, the numbers on the page burning into his mind. 99.9%. Not 50. Not maybe. Not inconclusive. They were his. The realization hit him like a freight train, knocking the breath out of him, leaving a kind of vulnerable rawness he hadn't felt in years. He let the paper fall to the table and looked at Ivy, truly looked at her, not just as the woman who'd once held his heart, but as the mother of his children. Of his children. "You should hate me," he murmured. "I did," Ivy admitted softly. "But not anymore. I don't have room for hate. I'm too busy trying to keep up with 2 tiny tornadoes who want cereal for dinner and think socks are optional." A small, strained laugh escaped Landon's lips. It was the first sound of life from him since he had opened that envelope. The air shifted slightly. He looked down once more at Ava and Ellie, who were now peeking at him, unsure what to make of the silent man in a $1,000 suit sitting frozen across the room. And for the first time in a long time, Landon didn't know what the next step should be. But he knew one thing for certain, everything had changed. The conference room felt unnaturally quiet, insulated from the soft hum of the lobby outside. Landon Pierce sat across from Ivy Monroe, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. The 2 toddlers, Ava and Ellie, sat quietly at Ivy's feet, fidgeting with the strings on their jackets, blissfully unaware of the emotional storm brewing above their heads. Landon's throat was tight. He didn't know where to start, didn't know how to start. His mind was still reeling from her words in the lobby. "These are your daughters. It echoed over and over, louder each time. "You can't just say that," Landon said finally, his voice low, but laced with disbelief. I was told I couldn't have children. I remember every word that doctor said like it was tattooed inside my skull." Ivy didn't flinch. She reached down, gently running a hand over Ava's curls, her other arm curled protectively around Ellie, who leaned quietly against her leg. "I know what you were told," she said softly. "I remember. You told me yourself, just days before you disappeared." Her voice carried no bitterness, only a quiet weight, like someone who had carried far too much for far too long. "You didn't just leave me, Landon. You erased yourself. You changed your number. You left the country. No forwarding address. No email. Nothing. I didn't even know what continent you were on." Landon's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He couldn't argue, because she was right. "I found out I was pregnant about 3 weeks after you vanished," Ivy continued, her voice trembling for the first time. "I thought I was sick, stress, maybe. But when the test turned positive, I didn't believe it. I thought it was broken. I took another. Then another. 6 in total." She looked up at him then, eyes shimmering, not angry, just tired. "I went back to the same specialist. I had the girls tested after they were born. Then again when they turned 1. And again last month." Her hand slipped into her bag. Without a word, she pulled out an envelope and placed it gently on the table between them. "I brought proof, not accusations," she said, her voice growing firmer. "I don't need anything from you. I never did. But you deserve to know. And they deserve the truth." Landon's fingers trembled as he reached for the envelope. His breath hitched as he opened it, pulling out the neatly folded paper inside. At the top was the name of a reputable genetics lab. Below it, black and white text. Charts. Figures. Statistical certainty. Landon Pierce, biological father. Probability, 99.9%. He stared at it, the air thick and unmoving around him. "I don't," he began, then stopped. "I don't understand how this is even possible." Ivy leaned forward slightly, her voice low but urgent. "I don't either. Maybe the doctors were wrong. Maybe it was a miracle. Maybe we were the exception to the rule. But does the how even matter anymore?" Her eyes flicked to the girls. Ava was now trying to climb into a chair, Ellie had nestled against her mother, thumb in her mouth, eyes drooping sleepily. "I didn't come here to blame you," Ivy said quietly. "I know you were hurting back then. I was too. But I kept thinking I could do it all myself. And for a long time, I did. I changed every diaper. I stayed up for every fever. I took every late shift to keep the lights on." Her voice cracked, and she blinked quickly to compose herself. "But when Ellie got sick last month, really sick, I realized I couldn't do it alone anymore. Not just for me. For them. They deserve to know who you are. They deserve to have you." Landon didn't speak. He couldn't. The weight of everything, her words, the test results, the guilt, the impossible reality, was crashing down all at once. His hands clenched into fists against the edge of the table. "I'm not asking for money," Ivy added softly. "I'm not asking for anything except that you don't disappear this time." She took a slow breath and looked him square in the eyes. "I waited a long time to have this conversation with you, Landon. I didn't want to drop it on you in the middle of your empire. But I also couldn't keep hiding the truth just because it was inconvenient. These girls are yours. And whether you're ready or not, that matters." And for the first time in years, Landon Pierce felt something unfamiliar pulse through his chest, not power, not pride, not even fear, but the unmistakable ache of consequence, and the terrifying possibility of something real. Landon Pierce had stared down boardrooms packed with billionaires. He had negotiated mergers worth billions without flinching, built an empire on algorithms and strategy, and crushed competitors with a single glance. But in that moment, standing in the small, softly lit conference room just off the lobby of his corporate headquarters, he couldn't seem to remember how to breathe. The silence between him and Ivy Monroe stretched like a rubber band pulled too tight. The room felt smaller now, thick with the unspoken history between them, and the presence of two very small, very real pieces of that history staring curiously up at him from below. Ava and Ellie, identical down to the soft curls of blonde hair framing their angelic faces, clung shyly to their mother's legs. Their wide blue eyes, mirrors of Ivy's, but also, unmistakably, his, watched Landon with innocent caution. He felt the earth tilt beneath him. Everything he thought he knew, everything he'd spent years tightly controlling, no longer made sense. "These are your daughters," Ivy had said minutes ago. And now those words echoed in his mind like a bomb that refused to stop ringing. He remained frozen, one hand still on the back of the conference chair he had just vacated. His perfectly tailored suit suddenly felt too tight, his throat too dry. The air conditioning hummed softly, indifferent to the emotional storm swirling inside him. He couldn't move. Couldn't speak. And then, Ava moved. She took a tentative step forward, her little sneakers squeaking faintly against the polished floor. Ivy didn't stop her. Maybe she knew he needed this moment more than he realized. Maybe she did too. Ava's small hand reached out, uncertain but steady, and came to rest gently on Landon's knee. The contact was feather-light, barely there. But for Landon, it hit with the force of a tidal wave. He dropped to one knee instinctively, slowly, carefully, his movements more reverent than any business deal he'd ever brokered. His eyes locked on hers, those wide, questioning eyes filled with a silent innocence that undid him. Ava didn't smile, didn't speak. She just looked up at him like she was trying to decide something, trying to understand who he was. And all he could think was how small her hand was. How trusting. Emotion surged like a dam cracking behind his ribs. His throat tightened, his vision blurred, not from the sharp clarity he used to pride himself on, but from tears he refused to let fall. "Not here. Not yet. I don't," he whispered, barely audible, "I don't know how to do this." Ivy said nothing. She stood behind her daughter, watching, her face soft with something that looked a lot like understanding, but also sorrow. She had done this alone. She had carried these girls, raised them, soothed their cries and kissed their bruises without him. And yet, here she was, offering him a chance. A second chance. Ava leaned in slightly, still resting her hand on his knee as if to say, "It's okay. I don't know who you are yet, but I don't hate you." And that undid him. Landon let out a shaky breath and, without thinking, gently placed his hand over hers. His palm engulfed her tiny fingers. Her skin was warm. Real. Alive. His. The moment stretched, timeless, delicate, dangerous in its depth. Behind them, Ellie tugged at Ivy's coat, seeking attention. Ivy knelt down beside her other daughter, but her eyes stayed locked on Landon. He finally looked up at her, 100 unspoken apologies written across his face. Ivy didn't look away. "I don't expect you to be perfect," she said quietly. "I just needed you to see them." Landon nodded slowly, his jaw clenched to keep the wave of emotions at bay. He didn't deserve this moment. But it was here. And he wasn't going to run from it. He turned back to Ava, her hand still resting on his knee, and whispered, "Hi. I'm Landon. I think I'm your dad." Her eyes blinked once, then twice, and though she didn't speak, she didn't move away either. Her tiny fingers curled slightly under his palm. And for the first time in his life, Landon Pierce felt powerless, in the best, most terrifying way possible. He had spent years building his life to keep pain out. Now, with one small hand on his knee, the walls were coming down. And maybe, just maybe, he was ready to let them. Landon Pierce wasn't a man easily shaken. He had faced global crises, multi-billion-dollar acquisitions, and courtroom battles without flinching. But as he stared at the second DNA test results spread out on the sleek surface of his penthouse kitchen counter, his hands trembled uncontrollably. 99.9% probability. Biological father, Landon Pierce. The first test from Ivy had been a punch to the gut. This second one, commissioned through an independent lab he trusted, was the slow twist of the knife. There were no loopholes. No errors. No business-like explanation that could write this off as some bizarre misunderstanding. The girls, Ava and Ellie, were his. He leaned back against the cool marble island, closing his eyes. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the silent room. Just days ago, he'd stood in this very kitchen thinking his life was perfectly in order. Now, the ground beneath him felt like sand, shifting with every breath. And still, he couldn't stop seeing Ava's wide, curious eyes, or the way Ellie clung to Ivy's leg, quietly studying him with a mix of fear and wonder. He hadn't even known they existed. He'd missed everything. Their first laughs. First words. First steps. He hadn't been there when they cried in the night, or when they reached out for a father who wasn't there. The guilt wasn't loud, it was insidious, wrapping around his ribs like a slow, constricting pressure he couldn't escape. That same afternoon, Landon picked up his phone and called Ivy. "I need to see them," he said simply, his voice hoarse. An hour later, he was standing in front of a modest brick building on the edge of Queens. It was a far cry from his world of penthouse towers and private elevators. Ivy's building was worn but alive, wind chimes danced on nearby balconies, potted plants lined the stairs, and the smell of fresh bread drifted from an open bakery around the corner. He hesitated at her door, heart pounding like a schoolboy. Then he knocked. Ivy opened it, her expression unreadable but not unkind. "You're here," she said softly, stepping aside. Landon entered slowly. The inside of her apartment was warm, chaotic, real. Toys littered the floor, children's drawings covered the fridge, and there was a faint scent of lavender and old coffee in the air. It was lived in, unapologetically so, and something about it hit him harder than he expected. The girls sat on a pale rug, surrounded by plush toys and building blocks. When they looked up, time seemed to still. Ava tilted her head with open curiosity, her features a haunting mirror of Ivy's, with a spark in her eyes that felt achingly familiar. Ellie was quieter, studying him with a wariness that made his chest tighten. He knelt down slowly, keeping his distance. "Hi," he said, his voice cracking despite his best effort. I'm Landon." The girls didn't respond, just watched. Ivy didn't interfere. She simply watched from the kitchen, giving him space to fall, if he dared. Ava was the first to move. She stood, clutching a worn-out stuffed rabbit in one hand, and approached cautiously. Then, with the gravity only a child could command, she held the rabbit out to him. Landon took it, his fingers trembling around the soft fabric. It was a peace offering. An invitation. And in that moment, kneeling on a cluttered floor, a child's toy in his hand, and Ivy's quiet presence nearby, Landon Pierce, the man who had once defined himself by control and detachment, felt something inside him start to shift. Not fast. Not easily. But undeniably. The truth had burned away the lies he told himself. Now, all that remained was what he chose to do next. Landon Pierce had sat through mergers worth billions without breaking a sweat. He had negotiated with the sharpest minds across continents, navigated hostile takeovers, and stood before cameras and shareholders with the confidence of a man who owned the sky. But nothing in his meticulously structured life had prepared him for this moment, sitting cross-legged on the floor of a modest apartment, just feet away from two tiny humans who stared at him like he was a stranger in a strange land. Ava and Ellie, his daughters, were nestled among a sea of plush toys and finger-painted drawings taped to the walls. The warmth of Ivy's home felt like a direct contrast to the sterile minimalism of his penthouse. It smelled like cinnamon and crayons and a life fully lived. It overwhelmed him. The girls watched him curiously. Ava, the bolder of the two, tilted her head slightly, her blue eyes scanning his face as if trying to place him in a memory that didn't exist. Ellie stayed closer to Ivy, gripping a stuffed bunny like it was a shield. Landon didn't dare move too fast. He sat quietly, shoulders stiff, pulse pounding in his neck. Ivy knelt beside Ellie, whispering something into her ear. The little girl peeked at him and then looked away quickly. Ivy glanced back at Landon and gave a small, encouraging smile. "They're still getting used to new faces," she said softly. Landon nodded slowly. "Of course. I'm not expecting anything." His voice cracked slightly, the words catching on the wall of emotion pressing against his throat. Ava suddenly stood and toddled forward. Landon froze. Her little hands were curled into fists, and her brow furrowed with the intense focus only toddlers possess. She stopped in front of him and, without a word, held up a small plush rabbit, worn at the edges, one ear flopped awkwardly. "An offering." Landon's throat tightened. He reached out with trembling fingers, accepting the toy like it was a sacred relic. Ava studied him for a beat longer, then turned and toddled back to her sister. The exchange had taken less than 10 seconds, but it shook him to the core. Ivy said nothing. She didn't need to. Her eyes shimmered with quiet emotion as she watched the girls settle back into their play. Landon stared down at the stuffed rabbit in his hands and realized it was the first time in years that someone had given him something with no agenda, no expectation, just pure, innocent trust. He swallowed hard and finally spoke, his voice low and uneven. "You've done an amazing job, Ivy." She blinked, startled by the sincerity in his voice. "It hasn't been easy," she admitted. "But they're worth everything." Landon looked at Ava and Ellie, his heart aching with a strange, unbearable tenderness. "I missed everything," he whispered. Ivy turned to him gently. "Maybe. But you're here now." That sentence struck deeper than she could have known. For a man who had built his life on being untouchable, invulnerable, those words felt like permission, to feel, to grieve, to hope. He sat back against the couch, eyes fixed on the girls, and allowed himself, for the first time, to imagine being a part of their world. Not as the man who owned boardrooms, but as the father who showed up for bedtime stories and scraped knees. And in that quiet living room, with a rabbit in his lap and forgiveness hanging in the air, Landon Pierce took his first, fumbling step into the messy, beautiful world of fatherhood. Landon Pierce was used to pressure. He thrived in high-stakes negotiations and multi-million-dollar decisions. But nothing in his life had prepared him for the delicate art of changing a diaper. He stood awkwardly in Ivy Monroe's small but warm apartment, staring at the baby wipes in one hand and a tiny pink onesie in the other. Ava, bold as ever, squirmed on the couch beside him, already halfway through removing her socks and giggling uncontrollably. Ellie sat beside her, watching with wide, uncertain eyes, more reserved, her thumb nestled securely between her lips. Ivy leaned against the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, trying, failing, not to laugh. "You're holding the wipes upside down," she said gently, amused. "I'm aware," Landon muttered under his breath, his expression tight with concentration. "They don't exactly cover this in Forbes." "You're doing fine," Ivy replied, stepping forward to help. Her hands brushed his as she adjusted the wipes, and for a brief second, time slowed. Her fingers were warm, steady, so different from his cold, calculated world. Ava squealed as Landon finally, with intense effort, managed to get the new diaper on. It was crooked. He knew it. But it was on. And she wasn't crying, so he counted that as a win. Not bad for your first try, Ivy said, offering a lopsided smile. Landon straightened, wiping his hands on a towel, then looked down at Ava, now patting her own belly proudly. A strange warmth settled in his chest, a mixture of pride, disbelief, and something terrifyingly close to love. I've negotiated international mergers with less stress than that, he admitted. She laughed softly. Parenthood's a different battlefield. He nodded, suddenly quiet. His gaze shifted to Ellie, who was still watching him carefully. She hadn't said much, but her eyes followed every movement he made, cautious, unsure. Landon crouched beside her, unsure of what to say, or even if he should speak. Ellie held out a crumpled drawing with a shaky, toddler-sized smile. Two stick figures, one taller, one smaller, stood beside a sun and two big hearts. It wasn't much. But Landon felt like the air had been knocked from his lungs. For me? He asked, voice cracking. She nodded solemnly. He took the paper as if it were made of glass. Thank you, sweetheart. Something shifted inside him. This wasn't just responsibility, it was something more primal. Protective. Emotional. Fragile. Real. Later that evening, Ivy made them grilled cheese sandwiches. Landon sat at the tiny kitchen table beside the twins, watching them laugh and trade halves like they'd done it 1,000 times. He was still stiff, still out of rhythm, but they didn't seem to mind. They had accepted his presence, even if he hadn't fully accepted it himself. Ivy sat across from him, eyes soft but measuring. They're still adjusting. You're new. It takes time. I know, he said, quietly. She paused, then added, but they like you. I can tell. He looked at her then, really looked, at the tired strength in her face, the weariness layered beneath her kindness. I don't know how you did all this alone. She shrugged. You just do. One day at a time. That night, as he helped tuck the girls into bed, reading from a worn picture book he could barely pronounce character voices from, Landon felt something click. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But deeply. As Ava curled beside Ellie, their blonde curls tangling, their little hands clutching stuffed toys, he lingered for a moment longer, watching them breathe in perfect rhythm. Ivy appeared beside him, her voice low. You're not so bad at this. He gave her a quiet smile. I still feel like I'm holding my breath. Welcome to parenthood, she whispered. And for the first time, Landon Pierce realized this wasn't a temporary detour in his life. It was the beginning of everything that really mattered. The autumn morning air was crisp, painting Central Park in a mosaic of amber and gold. The leaves rustled gently underfoot as Landon Pierce walked beside Ivy Monroe, their twin daughters bundled warmly in a double stroller that squeaked every few feet. The sun, low in the sky, filtered through the trees, casting soft halos around them. Landon had attended countless high-profile events, closed multi-million-dollar deals, and dined in the most luxurious corners of the world, but nothing felt as surreal, or as nerve-wracking, as this quiet walk through a city park with the family he never knew he had. Ivy glanced over at him occasionally, her expression unreadable. She hadn't said much since they left her apartment, and Landon couldn't blame her. This wasn't the kind of thing you just settled into. He was still trying to reconcile the absurd miracle of his paternity. 2 identical daughters. After being told he was biologically incapable. After walking away from Ivy years ago without a backward glance. Landon broke the silence first. They seem to love the outdoors. They do, Ivy replied softly. Ellie likes watching the birds, and Ava, well, she tries to chase the squirrels. He laughed under his breath. Figures. She's the bold one. Ivy nodded. Very. Just like you used to be. That made Landon pause mid-step. Used to be. They reached a small playground nestled between the trees, the sound of children's laughter echoing from the swings and slides. Ivy parked the stroller near a bench and carefully unbuckled the twins. Ava immediately tried to wriggle free, eager to run. Ellie clung to her mother's coat for a moment, then cautiously followed her sister across the grass. Landon hovered nearby, his movements stiff, unsure. Every instinct in his body told him to protect them, to be close, but he didn't want to overwhelm. Ivy watched him carefully as he knelt near the sandbox where Ava was already shoveling leaves into a plastic pail. "Landon," Ivy said quietly behind him. He turned to face her, her expression gentle but serious. "You can go to them. You don't need my permission." He gave a small nod and took a few tentative steps toward Ellie, who stood watching her sister with wide eyes. He crouched down slowly, lowering himself to her level. "Hey," he said softly. "You like it here?" Ellie blinked, then gave a tiny nod. She didn't smile, but she didn't step away either. That was something. As the minutes passed, Landon found himself sitting in the grass beside his daughters, Ava babbling and handing him leaves, Ellie gently holding onto his jacket sleeve. The quiet acceptance in their small gestures tugged at something deep inside him. These weren't just random moments. They were beginnings. He felt Ivy sit down on the bench nearby. He glanced at her, the distance between them no longer measured in feet but in years of silence, mistakes, and missed chances. "I wish I'd known earlier," Landon said suddenly, his voice rougher than he expected. "About them. About everything. I thought I was protecting you when I left. I thought walking away was better than dragging you into a life I didn't think I could give you." "You weren't protecting me," Ivy replied, her tone calm but laced with pain. "You were protecting yourself." He looked down, guilt settling in his chest like lead. "But you're here now," she added after a pause. "And they need you now." "So do I." Landon met her eyes. "I want to be here, Ivy. I want to be part of this. Even if I don't know how." Ava toddled over then and clumsily dropped a stick in his lap like a gift. Landon smiled, a real one this time, and Ivy saw it. She didn't say anything else, but she didn't have to. In that park, on that bench, something began to shift between them. It wasn't forgiveness yet. But it was hope. The late afternoon sun filtered through the thinning autumn leaves as Landon and Ivy sat side by side on a weathered park bench. Nearby, Ava and Ellie toddled across the grass, giggling as they chased falling leaves, their tiny feet crunching over the scattered amber and gold. The crisp air carried the scent of earth and distant bonfires, and though the park bustled with life, a fragile, charged stillness surrounded them. Landon sat hunched forward, elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on his daughters. He hadn't spoken in several minutes, and Ivy waited quietly, sensing the weight pressing on him. His shoulders, usually squared with confidence, were slouched now, heavy with something deeper than fatigue. "I wish I'd known earlier," he said suddenly, his voice low and rough. Ivy turned to look at him, surprised by the tremor in his tone. He didn't meet her gaze, his eyes still on the twins, who now clumsily tried to climb a small set of steps leading to the slide. "I wish I hadn't run away. I missed so much." The confession hung in the air, vulnerable and unguarded. Ivy folded her hands in her lap, her heart tightening at the raw honesty in his voice. She had never expected Landon Pierce, the man who once built an empire on logic and control, to speak like this. She swallowed hard, her own thoughts racing back to lonely nights, solo doctor visits, birthdays without a second parent, and how often she had wondered what might have been. "We both made mistakes," Ivy said gently. "I could have tried harder to find you. But at the time, I believed you didn't want to be found." Landon flinched slightly, as though her words had struck a nerve, but he didn't deny it. "I didn't," he admitted after a long pause. "Not because I didn't care. God, Ivy, I cared too much. I was just broken." That diagnosis, it wasn't just about not being able to have kids. It was like the world quietly declared me defective. Unworthy. And I didn't want you to see me like that. Finally, he turned to face her. His brown eyes were glassy with unshed emotion, his jaw tight with restraint. I thought disappearing was mercy, he continued. For you. For me. But all it did was leave damage in places I didn't understand until now. Ava squealed with delight as she slid down and landed softly at the bottom, Ellie following seconds later, her face lit up with pride. Their laughter cut through the tension between their parents, reminding them both of what this moment was really about. I see them now, Ivy, Landon said, his voice cracking slightly. I see what I missed, and I hate that I did. I hate that you had to go through this alone. I was so sure I was doing the right thing, and I was so incredibly wrong. She reached out without thinking, her fingers brushing his lightly on the bench. A silent offering, not of forgiveness, not yet, but of understanding. Landon looked down at their hands, then back at her. I'm not the same man who left, he said. And I don't expect things to go back to what they were. But I want to be here now. Really here. For Ava. For Ellie. For you, if you'll let me. Ivy stared at him for a long, breathless moment. Then she nodded slowly. I don't know what this will look like, Landon. But I see you trying. And that means more than you know. And in that small, trembling space between what was and what might be, something quietly began to heal. The rain came fast and heavy that evening, soaking the city in a cold, relentless downpour. Landon Pierce was mid-sentence in a high-stakes investor meeting when his phone vibrated. He normally ignored personal calls during work, but the name flashing on the screen, Ivy Monroe, froze him. He answered quickly, rising from the sleek conference room table without excuse. On the other end, Ivy's voice was strained, breathless, barely steady. It's Ellie, she said. She has a fever, hi. She's been crying for an hour, and I can't get her to calm down. I don't know what to do, Landon. She didn't have to say more. He was already moving. 15 minutes later, Landon stood drenched outside Ivy's apartment building, rainwater dripping from his dark wool coat, heart pounding louder than the thunder above. Ivy met him at the door, her hair tangled and damp, eyes red-rimmed from worry and exhaustion. She's in the nursery, she whispered, stepping aside. I tried everything. Tylenol. Cool towels. Nothing's working. He followed her inside without a word. The apartment, usually warm and inviting, felt tense, air thick with anxiety. A faint, pained whimper echoed from the back room. Landon's chest clenched as he entered and saw Ellie, flushed and glassy-eyed, curled up restlessly in her crib. Her tiny body shook with soft sobs. Without hesitation, he reached in and gently lifted her. She felt impossibly hot and heartbreakingly small in his arms. She whimpered weakly, pressing her cheek into his chest. Landon rocked her instinctively, whispering words he didn't even know he knew. It's okay, baby girl. Daddy's here. I've got you. Ivy hovered near the doorway, clutching her phone. I called the pediatrician. They think it's a virus, but we need to monitor her closely tonight, especially if the fever spikes again. Landon nodded. I'm not leaving. The hours crawled by. Ivy and Landon took turns holding Ellie, offering her sips of water, cooling her forehead with gentle cloths. Lily, roused by the commotion, peeked sleepily from her crib, worried but quiet. In the dim light of the living room, Landon sat on the couch, Ellie finally drifting into an uneasy sleep in his arms. Ivy settled beside him, her frame weary, hands trembling slightly from fatigue. For a long time, they sat in silence, broken only by Ellie's uneven breathing and the rain tapping softly against the window. Then Ivy leaned against him, hesitantly at first, resting her head on his shoulder. Landon stilled, heart thudding at the soft weight of her touch. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I'm glad you're here. I didn't realize how much I needed someone. I always thought I had to do this alone." Landon turned his head slightly, brushing his lips against her hair in a gesture so natural it surprised even him. "You don't have to anymore, Ivy. You've been carrying all of this alone for too long. I'm here. For both of them, and for you." She let out a soft, shaky breath and nodded. "I know," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I can see it." They stayed that way through the night, two former lovers, two overwhelmed parents, tethered now by something stronger than the past, a sick child in need of both their arms. By morning, Ellie's fever broke, her cheeks no longer flushed, her breathing soft and even. Landon looked down at her sleeping face and knew that something had shifted, not just in her, but in him. Something that could never go back to what it was. For the first time, he didn't feel like a visitor in this life. He felt like a father. And he was exactly where he was meant to be. The apartment was cloaked in a hushed stillness, broken only by the soft, labored whimpers of a feverish child. Rain tapped steadily against the windows, blurring the city lights beyond, as if the world outside had faded to make room for something more intimate, more urgent. Landon Pierce sat on the worn couch, his expensive clothes damp from the storm, his tailored image unraveling under the weight of worry. In his arms, Ellie shifted restlessly, her flushed cheeks radiating heat against his chest. Her tiny hands gripped the fabric of his shirt, her breathing shallow, eyes glazed and unfocused. Landon had never felt more helpless. He rocked gently, murmuring low reassurances he wasn't even sure she could hear. Words like "Daddy's here" and "You're okay, baby" came from him unbidden, foreign, unfamiliar, but strangely right. Ivy returned from the bedroom, phone in hand, her expression tight with concern but less frantic than before. "The pediatrician says it's likely a virus," she said quietly, kneeling beside him. "We need to keep her cool, hydrated, and watch her overnight. She might spike again." Landon nodded, his arms tightening around Ellie instinctively. "I'll stay tonight," he said, his voice low but resolute. Ivy blinked, surprised by the certainty in his tone. She didn't argue. Instead, she offered a soft nod, and the smallest flicker of relief passed through her tired eyes. What followed was a long, sleepless night of teamwork, of shared vigilance and whispered comfort. They took turns cooling Ellie's forehead with damp cloths, offering her sips of water, and soothing her whenever she whimpered in discomfort. Landon never left her side. He held her through each feverish wave, whispering lullabies Ivy never knew he knew, brushing her curls away with gentle, shaking hands. In the dim glow of the nursery nightlight, with Ellie finally resting against his shoulder, Ivy eased down beside him on the couch. She exhaled slowly, letting the silence stretch, letting the intimacy of the moment settle over them like a fragile blanket. Her head found its way to his shoulder, tentative at first, then sure. Landon stiffened slightly at the contact, then slowly relaxed, his cheek resting lightly against her hair. The scent of her shampoo, faint jasmine, filled his senses with a rush of old memories. But it wasn't nostalgia he felt. It was now. It was presence. "I'm glad you're here," Ivy whispered after a long beat. Her voice cracked, barely audible over the hum of the heater and Ellie's softened breaths. "I didn't realize how much I needed someone until now." Landon swallowed hard, emotion catching in his throat. He turned his head slightly, pressing a soft kiss to the top of Ivy's head, an action so instinctual it startled even him. "You don't have to do this alone anymore," he said, his voice low, reverent. "I promise I'm here, for all of you." There were no dramatic declarations. No soaring music. Just the steady rhythm of their breathing and the fragile truth settling between them. Ivy didn't answer immediately. She didn't need to. Her body leaning into his was answer enough. For the first time in years, Landon didn't feel the familiar rush of needing to escape. He didn't feel the weight of his image or the burden of perfection. Instead, he felt something that had eluded him for far too long: belonging. He wasn't just a visitor in their lives anymore. He was part of it now. Tangibly, irrevocably. As dawn crept through the curtains, bathing the room in a pale, golden light, Landon watched Ellie sleep peacefully in his arms, Ivy's breath warm against his neck. And in that quiet, exhausted stillness, he knew with certainty, the man who had once chosen solitude now had something infinitely more valuable. He was no longer alone. A brisk autumn breeze swept through the park as golden leaves danced in circles around the stroller. The twins, Ava and Ellie, giggled from inside, bundled in cozy jackets and wool hats, their laughter rising into the crisp morning air. Landon Pierce walked beside Ivy Monroe in silence, his hands stuffed in his coat pockets, heart pounding beneath the tailored fabric. The sun filtered gently through the thinning trees, casting flickering shadows across the pathway. Ivy looked ahead, occasionally glancing at the girls with soft affection, her golden hair pulled into a loose braid, strands slipping free with the wind. Landon couldn't help but steal glances at her, struck by how much she had endured, how she had raised 2 children alone, with strength, with grace, and without him. He hadn't meant to fall into step beside her. At first, he told himself it was for the girls, that this was just another chance to connect with them. But now, every moment spent near Ivy carved into him with memories he had tried to bury: her laughter, her tears, the sound of her voice in the quiet before sleep. It all came back so effortlessly. As they reached the edge of the small playground nestled beneath rustling branches, Ivy unbuckled Ava and Ellie and let them toddle toward the grass. Landon instinctively stepped forward, eyes scanning for potential hazards. When Ava tripped and fell to her knees, he was there before Ivy even moved, helping her up gently and brushing leaves from her coat. She blinked up at him with those same deep brown eyes, then wrapped her tiny arms around his leg without a word. Something in him twisted sharply. Love. Regret. Something in between. Ivy watched quietly from a nearby bench. Landon returned to her side, settling next to her with a strange mix of nerves and calm. For a moment, neither spoke, content to watch the girls giggle as they explored the slide and the small jungle gym. Then, slowly, Landon exhaled. "I wish I'd known earlier," he said, his voice low and raw. "I wish I hadn't shut you out. I missed so much, Ivy. Too much." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she picked a leaf off her coat, turning it in her fingers. "We both made choices," she finally said. "I could have tried harder to find you. But after you left, after the diagnosis, I thought you didn't want to be found." He shook his head, guilt heavy in his chest. "That wasn't it. It wasn't about you. It was about me. I didn't think I could be the kind of man you deserved. And after the doctor told me, I just ran. I convinced myself disappearing would hurt less." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the squeak of the swing and the shriek of delighted toddler laughter. Ivy stared straight ahead, her expression unreadable. Then she turned to him, eyes softened but still cautious. "You've come further than I thought you would," she said. "I didn't expect you to be here like this. I didn't expect anything, honestly." Landon looked at her, really looked at her. The tired strength in her face. The unspoken forgiveness buried deep in her gaze. "I don't deserve this," he murmured, "but I want to earn it. I want to keep showing up, not just for them. For you, too." Ivy nodded slowly, folding her arms against the cold, her eyes misting over. "Then just keep doing what you're doing. Be present. Be honest." He gave a faint, hopeful smile, one that felt foreign on his face. "I can do that." For a while, they sat there in silence. Not as ex-lovers. Not even as co-parents. But as two people finally beginning to understand the cost of what they had lost, and the quiet hope of what they might still rebuild. The hum of the dishwasher was the only sound filling the kitchen, broken now and then by the faint creak of the wood floors as Landon Pierce moved quietly beside Ivy Monroe. The twins had finally gone down for the night, after a particularly chaotic bath time that ended with more water on the floor than in the tub. Ivy, damp curls falling from her messy bun, handed him the last rinsed plate. Landon dried it with care, his movements uncharacteristically slow. He wasn't used to domestic rhythm. In fact, before Ivy and the girls re-entered his life, he barely cooked for himself. His fridge was usually a graveyard of takeout containers and unopened bottles of designer water. But here, in this warm, lived-in kitchen with plastic cups drying beside ceramic ones, and hand-drawn crayon art taped to the fridge, he felt grounded. Changed. Ivy glanced at him out of the corner of her eye as she rinsed out a baby bottle, sensing something brewing in his silence. Landon looked different these days, less polished, maybe, but more present. There were dark circles under his eyes from sleep deprivation, a band-aid on his finger from a clumsy run-in with a can opener, and a looseness in his posture that hadn't been there before. He wasn't just playing house. He was showing up. She handed him the bottle. He took it, paused, and set it gently on the drying rack. Then he turned to face her, his eyes serious, his breath slightly uneven. "Ivy," he said softly. "These last few months have changed everything for me." She froze slightly, her hand resting on the edge of the sink. She didn't look at him right away. "The girls, being their father, being here with you, it's more than I ever thought I could have. Or deserved." She finally turned to meet his eyes, wary but open. "I know I hurt you," Landon continued, voice tight. "I pushed you away. Back then, I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting you, from me, from what I lacked. But now, I see what I missed. I see what I almost threw away." Her breath caught slightly, eyes glinting with both emotion and restraint. "I don't want us to just be co-parents," he said, taking a hesitant step closer. "I want more, Ivy. I want us. Again. For real this time." The room went still. Ivy stared at him, stunned. Her mouth opened, then closed. The weight of his words pressed down on her chest. She had hoped, maybe even dreamed of hearing something like this, but now that it was happening, fear clenched her heart. "Landon," she said slowly, carefully, "I've felt something shift between us, too. I see the way you've shown up. I see how much you've tried." He nodded, waiting. "But," she added, her voice trembling slightly, "I can't lie. I'm scared. You left before. And when you did, the damage was real. I don't know if I can trust you, again so easily." "I get it," Landon said gently. "I don't expect trust overnight. I just want the chance to earn it. Every day. I'll prove I'm not the man who walked away. Not anymore." He reached out slowly, not to pull her in, but to offer. Ivy looked down at his hand, and after a beat, placed hers in it. Her fingers were warm, hesitant, but real. "I'm willing to try," she whispered. "But you have to be patient with me. This isn't easy." A slow, relieved smile broke across Landon's face as he squeezed her hand gently. "I'll be patient as long as it takes." For the first time in years, they stood not on opposite ends of a broken past, but on the same side of a possible future. The late afternoon sun filtered through budding trees as golden light dappled the soft grass beneath their feet. A gentle breeze stirred wildflowers scattered across the quiet park, the same one where months earlier, Landon had taken his first real steps toward becoming a father. Now, this place, once unfamiliar and daunting, felt like sacred ground. Landon Pierce stood among a small gathering of people he now considered family. Ivy Monroe's sister, a few of their closest friends, and even a couple of Landon's longtime colleagues, now more like brothers, milled about, sipping lemonade and chasing after Ava and Ellie, whose giggles danced through the air like music. There were picnic blankets strewn across the grass, cupcakes half-eaten in toddler fists, and balloons tangled in tree branches overhead. It was a scene that would have once made Landon feel out of place. Today, he belonged. He watched Ivy from a distance, her soft laughter blending with the sounds of the girls squealing with joy. She wore a simple sundress, her golden hair falling in waves over her shoulders, her cheeks flushed from chasing the twins around. Landon had never seen her look more radiant, or more at peace. She was the heart of this life, and the reason it existed. His hand brushed the small velvet box in his pocket, and for a moment, his breath caught. Not from fear, but from meaning. From everything this moment had come to represent. As the sun dipped closer to the horizon, casting a golden glow across the park, Landon crossed the grass slowly. Ivy looked up, puzzled at first, until she saw his expression. Calm. Serious. Vulnerable. He reached for her hand. "Come with me for a second," he said softly. She followed him without question, a curious smile playing on her lips. A few steps away, beneath a low-hanging branch dotted with new spring leaves, he turned to face her. For a moment, they just stood there, the world falling into quiet around them. Ava and Ellie were safe, playing nearby. Their friends chatted softly in the background. But for Landon, this moment belonged only to them. "I used to think I wasn't meant for this," he began, his voice quiet but steady. "Not for love. Not for family. And definitely not for someone like you. I pushed everything good away because I didn't know how to keep it." Ivy's eyes softened, and she squeezed his hand. "But you came back," Landon continued, voice thickening with emotion. "You came back when it mattered most. You brought our daughters. And you gave me a second chance I didn't deserve. Now I wake up every day knowing exactly who I am. And it's not because of what I've built. It's because of you, and them, and this life." His hand trembled slightly as he reached into his pocket and pulled out the box. Ivy's breath caught. Her hand flew to her mouth as tears welled in her eyes. He opened the box, revealing a simple, elegant ring. "Ivy Monroe," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Will you marry me? Not for show, not out of obligation, but because I want to keep building this messy, beautiful, imperfect life with you. For real. Forever." Her breath hitched. For a long second, she didn't move. Then Ivy nodded, slowly, surely, as tears spilled freely down her cheeks. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, of course. I never stopped loving you." Landon slipped the ring onto her finger with shaking hands, and Ivy stepped forward, wrapping her arms tightly around his neck as if to hold the moment still. From across the park, Ava and Ellie noticed the sudden excitement. They clapped their hands, oblivious to what had just occurred, but instinctively joyful. Their laughter reached them like a blessing. Landon held Ivy close, then crouched down and scooped the girls into their embrace. The four of them, father, mother, daughters, folded together in a warm, perfect circle of love. There were no grand speeches. No orchestras. Just the heartbeat of something real, something rebuilt from brokenness. And in Ivy's eyes, Landon saw the rest of his life, finally clear, finally true. The sun filtered gently through the lace of white light strung between the trees in Ivy's sister's backyard. A soft breeze rustled the early spring leaves, carrying the scent of wildflowers and something warmer, hope. It wasn't the kind of venue a billionaire CEO usually chose, but nothing about this moment was about wealth. It was about truth. About the second chance neither Landon nor Ivy ever thought they'd live to see. Landon Pierce stood under a modest wooden arch wrapped in ivy and soft white blooms, wearing a navy suit with no tie, his hands slightly trembling. Not from nerves, he'd negotiated billion-dollar deals in front of global media without flinching. But this was different. His heart thundered against his ribs like it wanted to speak first. The quiet murmurs of their closest friends and family faded into the background as the music started, gentle, acoustic, tender. Then, from behind the house, two small figures appeared, Ava and Ellie, their twin daughters, dressed in matching white dresses and flower crowns that tilted slightly as they toddled forward. Petals tumbled from their small fists in chaotic handfuls, and the crowd chuckled with teary smiles. Landon's chest tightened. This imperfect, beautiful chaos, was everything he never knew he needed. And then he saw her. Ivy stepped forward, framed by light, wearing a simple ivory dress that skimmed her figure like a whisper. Her golden hair was swept back, a few loose curls softening the edges of her face. But it was her eyes, steady, shimmering with emotion, that locked him in place. She looked not just like a bride, but like a lighthouse. A woman who had weathered storms and still stood tall, radiating strength and grace. As she walked toward him, Landon's mind flashed back, hospital lights, a DNA test, a feverish child in his arms, a quiet promise whispered on a rain-soaked night. Every moment that had led to this one thundered through his chest. And then she was there, standing in front of him, her hands reaching for his. He took them with reverence, grounding himself in her warmth. They didn't need a pastor's script to speak what mattered. Landon's voice was rough, unsteady, but clear. I once believed I wasn't built for love. That control and success were safer. But then you walked back into my life, and you brought our daughters. You gave me something success never could, a family. Ivy, I don't vow perfection. I vow presence. I vow to show up. Every day. For you. For them. Tears welled in Ivy's eyes, but her voice was calm. I used to think no one would fight for me. Not really. And you didn't, at first. You ran. But when it mattered, you came back. You stayed. And you've shown me that sometimes the second chance is the one that truly lasts. Landon, I vow to forgive what we were and embrace what we are now. Their daughters giggled somewhere behind them, and the crowd sniffled collectively. When they kissed, slow, real, full of everything they couldn't say, the world didn't cheer. It exhaled. Later, as the sun dipped low and the trees cast long shadows over picnic blankets and half-eaten cupcakes, Landon scooped Ava into his arms while Ivy twirled with Ellie. Laughter rang out like music, and time seemed to pause, not in a grand fairy tale moment, but in something better. Something real. That night, as they laid their girls to sleep and stood in the doorway of their shared home, Ivy turned to Landon and whispered, I never imagined my life like this. He kissed her hand, resting his forehead to hers. Me neither, he replied. But I wouldn't change a thing. They hadn't built a fantasy. They had built something truer. A family. A future. A beginning, this time, forever. Winter had melted into spring, and with it, so had the ice that once encased Landon Pierce's heart. Each morning now began not with stock reports or conference calls, but with the sound of small feet pattering into his bedroom and two little voices shouting, Daddy. Ava's giggle was always a beat ahead of Ellie's more gentle laughter. He had memorized the way their arms wrapped tightly around his legs, like vines clinging to something steady, something rooted. It still caught him off guard sometimes, how he had changed. Years ago, he had defined his worth through boardroom victories, quarterly earnings, and the pristine silence of his penthouse in Manhattan. But that version of himself, the one that kept everything and everyone at a distance, was gone now. Replaced, not overnight, but inch by inch, by something warmer and infinitely more human. He still ran his tech empire. His name still appeared in Forbes. But his sharp edge had softened. His staff noticed how he now paused to ask about someone's weekend. How he rescheduled late meetings if it meant making it to Ava and Ellie's bedtime. Once, that would have felt like a weakness. Now, it felt like a privilege. In the evenings, he'd return not to silence, but to Ivy's soft hum as she made dinner, toys scattered across the floor, the girls squealing in the bath. He'd kneel down, roll up his sleeves, and get soaked washing tiny hands, helping with tangled hair, and listening to stories about their day at preschool, stories that often went nowhere but meant everything. Ivy watched him sometimes with that quiet, searching look she had, measuring whether this new Landon would truly stay. He didn't blame her. She had every right to doubt. But each night, he gave her more reasons not to. And she had changed him just as much. Ivy was no longer the woman he had left behind in his fear. She was stronger now. Softer, too, but in a way that came from surviving, not surrendering. She didn't need him to fix anything. She only needed him to show up. And he did. Every day. They had moved into a cozy house just outside the city. It wasn't massive. It didn't need to be. It had a porch where the girls chased bubbles and a backyard where fireflies danced at night. It was a far cry from his penthouse view, but this view, this life, was real. Some nights, after the girls were asleep, Landon and Ivy would sit in the kitchen, sipping tea, talking in hushed tones about schools, about vacations, maybe even about adding to their family one day. There was no pressure, no deadline. Just the comfort of two people who had once broken apart and now knew how to hold each other better. One such night, Ivy rested her head on his shoulder and whispered, "I never thought I'd find peace again, after everything." Landon wrapped his arm around her and murmured into the quiet, "You gave it to me. You were the beginning of everything." She didn't respond with words. She didn't have to. Her hand found his, lacing their fingers together as if to say, "We're here. We made it." And they had. In every chaotic bedtime, in every scraped knee, every whispered apology and hard-won promise, they had built something real. Not perfect. Not easy. But lasting. Landon had found something far greater than redemption. He had found joy, not loud, not public, but quiet, steady, and sacred. The kind that doesn't announce itself but stays. The kind built from second chances, unconditional love, and the courage to try again. And in that quiet kitchen, surrounded by the soft hum of their home, Landon Pierce knew, without a shadow of doubt, that this was the greatest success of his life. Share your thoughts in the comments. On a scale of 0 to 10, how would you rate this story? Also, let us know where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications to stay up to date on all of our stories. And don't forget to check out more heartwarming stories by clicking here on the end screen.